So I'm Anja Slim, I'm from maths, but what I'm going to be talking about is actually mostly the work of my PhD student, Rahil Villani, who was here in the School of Physics and graduated a few years ago. Absolutely amazing student, is actually now at the University of Oxford. And Tapio Simula, who also used to be here and is now at the University of Swinburne. And Rosemary asked for something beautiful, and this is, I think, one of the most beautiful things that I've been involved with, so I hope you enjoy it, and there's also a dynamical systems flavor. So a phenomenon that we're all familiar with is if you have a vessel with some liquid and you vibrate it up and down, if you vibrate it gently enough, then the surface remains flat. But if you vibrate it sufficiently vigorously, then it will get surface waves, Faraday waves. And so here I've just depicted this by what's going to be a loudspeaker, because we did a bunch of experiments with a little Petri dish mounted on a loudspeaker in order to get these waves. And what's been known for a long time is that if you have a droplet of the same liquid, it will bounce on the surface of this liquid in the vessel. But if you're close enough to what's known as the Faraday threshold, so the threshold above which you start to get these Faraday waves, if you're just beneath it, then when the droplet comes down, it interacts with the bath and it generates some Faraday waves. They're decaying waves, but it does generate them. And if you're very close to the threshold, they decay very slowly. And so the droplet, when it comes down again, can interact with the wave on the subsequent bounce that it makes. And so I've got a video here from Rahil as to what happens. So here's a droplet bouncing on the surface. You can see the waves that it's generating. It'll speed up in a moment. And you'll see that very gradually it does make its way across this bath. And for mere mortal fluid dynamicists such as myself, who really struggled with quantum mechanics at university,
you didn't have a good teacher.
there was this hope that we might actually be able to understand something about quantum mechanics this way, because the droplet was behaving as a particle, but it was interacting with its world through this wave that it had created. And so one of the early experiments that was done was trying to reproduce the interference fringes from the double slit experiment. So we've got a droplet that started off life here. We've got some barriers here. The droplet goes through one of the two slits, but its wave interacts with the geometry of the slit, and so it guides the droplet once it gets through the slit into a particular path. And so there are some particular angles that the droplet preferentially will go to. And so when they did a lot of experiments, they sort of saw something that vaguely resembled the diffraction pattern. I'm not brave enough to try to talk about hydrodynamic quantum analogues in the School of Physics, so I'm not going to focus on that aspect of these droplets, but instead on some of the nice fluid dynamics that comes along with it. So here again is the standard Walker that had been discovered, and they have a very quite tight size range. So they're between 0.6 and 1 millimeter in diameter. Can walk fairly quickly for a droplet, 1.5 centimeters per second. But they, because of this narrow size range, the dynamics are actually a little bit restricted. And an amazing discovery that Rahil made during his PhD was that if you add a little bit of the subharmonic frequency, so half the frequency, you can get much bigger droplets to walk. So you can get droplets that are twice the size, even 3 times the size, so these are really big beasts, and 3 times the diameter, I should say, right? So the volume is a lot bigger to walk, and they can walk at up to 3 times the speed. And this allows a huge plethora of extra dynamical behaviors that I'll show towards the end. But the first thing I want to do is explain how these things are created, because we were like, well, what has this extra subharmonic frequency? Like, why does this help these things to work? And so I'll show you a little bit of theory that explains very simply actually how they work. So I should just say, so Rahil coined these normal superwalkers, because so they're superwalkers, they walk fast. They're normal because they're kind of nice and round and look a bit like the traditional walkers. And he called these jumbo superwalkers because these are gigantic and have a lot of mass. All right, so for the model, we're going to go into the frame of reference of the bath. So gravity is changing on us. So So we've got our normal component of gravity, and then we've got two components because the bath is vibrating up and down from both the normal frequency, the main frequency, and from this subharmonic frequency. And so we care about three variables. We care about the height of the bottom of the droplet from the bath, from the background bath height, the wave height, the wave field, and the horizontal location of the droplet as well. And you can then come up with a really quite simple model to describe how these droplets move. So for our vertical motion, just Newton's law, mass times acceleration, so mass of the droplet times the vertical acceleration, is our gravity term, and then we have a normal force from the bath. And this is modeled by a simple spring and damper system when the droplet is in close proximity with the bath. And then for the horizontal motion, we have mass times horizontal acceleration is a drag term proportional to the velocity. And then we also have a component of this normal force in the horizontal direction because the wave has a slope. Okay, so we have this dh dx term that gives us the component of the normal force in that direction. Where things get a little bit more complicated is the wave field, but it's still not too bad. So the wave field is the sum of the waves created by every previous bounce of the droplet. So the previous bounces occurred at locations xn at time tn, and each of them created a wave that looks like the following. So there's an amplitude, there's a cosine in time terms because it's going up and down the wave. There's a Bessel function, so the shape of the wave in space is sort of like your traditional picture that you would expect a wave to look like. You've got an exponential decay in time because these waves were below the Faraday threshold, these waves decay, and then we have a diffusive term as well. And we have two components because we have two driving frequencies. And so Rahil was able to solve these really nicely. I won't go into the details of that, but I'll show you some of the solutions and how it explains these big bouncing droplets. But before I do that, I just want to explain the pictures that you're about to see. So we're going to go back into the lab frame. We're only going to care about the up and down motion of the droplet. And there are going to be three curves over time. So one is of the average height of the bath. So that's going to be the black dot. And so you can see it's going up and down because the whole thing is going up and down. There's this sort of grey-blue dot. So that's the surface of the bath. You can see it's almost going up and down like the bath itself, but it's a little bit off because of the wave. And then you've got the bottom of the droplet, which is the red curve. And so what we would just focus on the top for right now. So this is a plain old walker, just a single frequency driving the bath. And again, this is just the up and down motion of the droplet, and we see that it has a ballistic motion up, comes back down again, interacts with the bath for a period of time, goes back up and comes back down. Very periodic behavior that we have. But crucially, it's doing one up and down for every two up and down of the bath. Okay, so this is a droplet that sits here. It's this green dot here. It's got a given radius and it walks at a given speed. If we increase the size of the droplet, it's basically doing the same thing, but it can't get quite as high because it's bigger. And so it's almost interacting with the in-between up and down of the bath. But not quite, so it's still doing more or less the same thing, so it still walks, it just walks a bit faster. If we make the droplet even bigger, it can't get over that intermediate up and down motion. So it crashes into the bath and it starts to do something very chaotic. And so now it can't walk anymore. Does survive, it still bounces, but with zero speed. If you make it even bigger, it crashes with such velocity that it coalesces with the bath and it disappears. If we add the second frequency in though, what happens is that the bath motion is now asymmetric. So we have one very large up and down motion and one quite small one. And this enables a droplet of the same size as this one to now get over the intermediate hump. And so it's now able to get into this nice one bounce for every two up-down motions of the bath and walk at a very fast speed. So Rahil was able to model that using a really quite simple dynamical system that somewhat reminds me of some of the gravitational models that you've looked at. Unfortunately, we can't yet explain what happens to the really big ones. So the really big ones, they basically don't leave the bath. How they survive, we have no idea. They're clearly deforming a lot internally. We can get some that do even more fancy things. So this is a droplet that's even bigger. It shouldn't exist, this really big one here. If it was on its own, it wouldn't exist at all. But it has this little satellite droplet, and this little satellite just goes round and round, and somehow the fact it has a satellite enables it to survive. Again, we have no idea how this works. As I said, we have all sorts of really interesting dynamical behaviors. So we have these two droplets. They just sit next to each other. There's a tiny little air gap, but it doesn't drain. They just manage to survive. I can get the same with three. We can get two droplets that chase each other. So they progressively go in this direction. So they're in the wells of their previous droplets. We can get one of these giant jumbo superwalkers with its companion. We can get two superwalkers that crash into each other and survive as well. And yeah. So a lot of these we can, so Rahil managed to predict quite a few of these behaviors, essentially with the model that I just described. But there are even more complex behaviors that can happen. So here we have a coalesced group, looks kind of like a solid, that jiggle. If you increase the amount of the second frequency here, that's the only thing that's happening between frames. So he increases it here. And then finally, if you make it really high, it behaves basically like a gas. So the droplets are just crashing off one another. I guess I'll leave that playing in the background. That was my last slide. What I wanted to finish with is a thank you to Rosemary. So when I first got to Monash, I was a fresh out, came as a lecturer, and I was teaching fluids together with Rosemary and Matt. So she was teaching the first half, I was teaching the second half. And I diligently came to all of her lectures, and I learned so much from watching how she taught and the level of detail, how she interacted with the students, what things she could skip, what things she couldn't skip, and I'm still benefiting from having gone to those lectures. I also wanted to say thank you that you're responsible for me getting into this really beautiful area. So at the very end of the lecture course, I gave the students just a snapshot of a few of the sort of recent interesting fluid things that were going on, and this was one of the things that I showed. And I didn't think any more of it after that. But Rosemary came to me and said, I've heard on the grapevine that the students really loved that hydrodynamic quantum analogues thing. Why don't you offer some vacation projects on it? Which I did. I had some really serious misconceptions about what was going on at the time, so it all ended up working out okay. But I got a few students, Rahil was one of them, who went on to do a PhD on this. So thank you, Rosemary.